good evening and welcome back. Coming out of the cold, draw the blanket up under your chin, and let the whole long day you have been carrying slip quietly off your shoulders and onto the floor, where you may leave it until morning. Tonight, we are going to climb a great staircase in a grand English country house. Up we go, past the gilded drawing rooms where the family sits after dinner, past the good bedrooms with their tall four-posters and their crackling fires, up and up, until the carpet gives way to bare scrub board and the candles grow fewer, to a small plain room near the very top of the house. A single candle is burning there. A young woman sits beside it with a book open on her knee that she is far too tired to read. She is neither a servant nor a daughter of the house. She is something stranger, something in between, and there was no one in all of Victorian England quite so alone in a crowded house as she was. She is the governess. And tonight, my friend, for a few slow and candlelit hours, you are going to be her. You will learn the peculiar law of her rank, the invisible line she may never cross in either direction. You will sit in the schoolroom with the children who are your whole world and none of your own. You will feel the cool, measuring gaze of the mistress of the house, and, I am sorry to say, you will hear a certain step upon the stair in the evening, the master's step, and feel your heart do a small foolish thing that you would never, ever confess to a living soul. It is the oldest story in the house, and the most quietly kept. Later tonight, when the fire has burned low, I will tell you the true stories of 3 real women who lived this exact life. One who turned all her hidden longing into the most famous story of its kind ever written. One who carried her schoolroom to the far side of the world and became a legend she barely recognized. And one gentle soul who, having no children of her own, found a whole family in a house that was not hers. If these slow journeys into the past bring you any comfort, a quiet tap on the like button helps other weary travelers find their way to this fireside, but only if you truly mean it. And before we begin, do tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening tonight, and what the hour is by your clock, for I dearly love to read them with my morning tea. Now, let the rain find the window. Let the candle lean and gutter. There is nothing you must do for the rest of this night but listen and drift. The year is 1863, and somewhere in a great house in the countryside, a bell is about to ring for you. Congratulations. You have just woken up as a Victorian governess. Now, before you decide how you feel about that, let me give you the good news and the bad news together, because in your position they are almost always the same facts seen from 2 sides. The good news is that you are a lady. You were born to a respectable family. You can read Latin and speak passable French. You play the pianoforte tolerably and sketch a ruin very prettily. And you have the manners and the accent of the class that gives orders rather than takes them. The bad news is precisely that you are a lady, and something has gone wrong. Your father, perhaps a clergyman or a half-pay officer, or a merchant with more optimism than luck, has died, or failed, or simply run out of money before he ran out of daughters. And a lady who must earn her bread has almost nowhere respectable to go. She cannot go into a shop, that is trade, she is ruined. She cannot go into service as a housemaid, that is beneath her, she is ruined differently. There is one narrow door open to her, one single occupation a gentlewoman may take up without falling out of her class entirely, and you have just walked through it. You have become a governess. You will teach other people's children, in other people's houses, for very little money, and you will be, from this morning onward, the loneliest educated woman in England. And consider, before we go further, how you even came to be here, in this bed, in this house, for the getting of the post was itself a small quiet humiliation you have not quite recovered from. There were no schools that trained a governess, no diploma, no letters after your name. There was only the family behind you, gone now, and the accomplishments they had given you as if they were a dowry, and, when the money failed, the newspaper. You sat at a borrowed table with the columns of small print, the advertisements, and you read the notices of ladies seeking situations and families seeking governesses, and you learn to read the cruel little code of them. Wanted, a governess, thoroughly competent to instruct in English, French, music, drawing, and the rudiments of Latin, of unexceptionable character and cheerful disposition, salary not to exceed £20. £20, mind, for the whole of you, your mind, your years, your loneliness, and your cheerful disposition thrown in for nothing. You wrote your careful letter in your best hand. You went to the register office, the governess agency, and sat in a row of other women exactly like yourself, each in her plainest good gown, each pretending not to see the others, each hoping to be chosen and dreading the choosing, like horses at a fair who can read the notice above their own heads. And then the interview, the cold drawing-room, the mistress who looked you over, the questions about your principles and your health and your teeth, very nearly, and the long silence while she decided whether you would do. You did. Here you are. And you must never let the family suspect how near the edge you came, nor how many houses you have already been let go from, for a governess without a place is a leaf in the wind, and a governess with too many past places is a leaf that is blown too often. You wake in a small room at the top of the house, and the very geography of it tells you your whole situation before you have opened both eyes. It is not the servant's attic, quite, and it is not a family bedroom, quite. It is near the nursery, because your life and the children's are bound together, and it is plainly furnished, a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, a small chest, a strip of drab carpet, and a window that, if you are fortunate, looks out over the park. The fire, if there is a fire at all, is small and burns down early, for coals cost money, and no one thinks a governess feels the cold quite as a real lady does. This morning there is a rime of frost on the inside of the glass, and the water in your jug has a skin of ice you must break with the back of the brush. You wash quickly, gasping, because a lady is always clean and a cold room does not excuse you, and you remind yourself, as you will remind yourself 100 times today, that self-pity is a luxury, and you cannot afford luxuries. Then you dress, and here, my friend, begins the first true rule of your strange new life. You must be plain. Not merely modest, not merely neat, but deliberately, artfully plain, and this is more difficult and more delicate than it sounds. A governess must be perfectly respectable in her dress and never, under any circumstance, the slightest bit attractive to the eye. Your gowns are gray, or brown, or a black that has faded toward green with age, high to the throat, plain at the wrist, without a ribbon or a flounce or a single bright thing to catch the light. You may not be shabby, for shabbiness would shame the family who employs you, but you may absolutely not be smart, for a smart governess is a threat, and everyone in the house, from the mistress to the youngest housemaid, will decide within a day whether you know your place, and your clothes will tell them first. So you smooth the gray merino, you pin the plain collar, you draw your hair back so severely that not one curl is permitted in a pinion, and you look at yourself for one moment in the small spotted mirror. Your whole wardrobe would fit into a single trunk, and you know every thread of it by heart. There is the gray merino for every day, and the black stuff gown for best and for church. Both of them turned once already, the worn seams unpicked, and the cloth made up afresh, with the faded side hidden away inside. A small economy every governess learns in her first year. There are gloves darned so finely at the fingertips that the darning has become its own quiet art. There is one good shawl, soft gray cashmere, the single beautiful thing you own, given to you by someone who loved you in the life before this one, and you keep it wrapped in tissue and take it out only when your heart has need of it. And there are your boots, resoled twice and blacked every night, for a lady is known by her boots, and yours must never, not once, be allowed to look poor. That is the whole of it. It is enough, if you are careful, and you have learned to be very careful indeed. You are 23. You are not unhandsome. And your entire professional survival depends on making quite sure that nobody in this house ever notices either of those things. You pinch a little color into your cheeks out of pure human vanity, then feel guilty, then leave it. The bell has rung. The children are waking. Your day begins in the one room in this vast house that truly belongs to you, and it is not this one. It is the schoolroom. But before the schoolroom, there is the descent, and the descent begins with prayers. In a well-run Victorian household, the whole establishment gathers each morning, before breakfast, for family prayers, and here, in one small daily ceremony, you may see your entire position laid out like a diagram. The family sits at the front, in chairs, facing the master, who reads. Behind them, on a bench or standing by the door, in careful order of rank, come the servants, the housekeeper and the cook and the butler nearest the family, then the footmen and the housemaids and the kitchen maid and the boy who does the boots, all scrubbed and solemn in the cold morning. And you? Where do you go, my friend, you who are neither one nor the other? You bring the children down, and you settle them, and then you take your own place, and there is no place marked for you. You are above the servants, so you may not sit among them. You are below the family, so you may not sit among them either. You perch, somewhere in between, on the invisible boundary line, a little apart from both, and you bow your head, and you say the responses in your low, clear voice, and you pray, and perhaps this morning your prayer is only, let me get through this day, and let me not mind so much. The master reads the lesson, the great Bible open before him, and his voice fills the cold room, and for the length of the reading the whole house is one thing, master and mistress and children and servants and you, all of you kneeling on the same hard floor before the same God who, you have been assured many times, is no respecter of persons. It is, you sometimes think, the only 10 minutes of the day when the wall around you thins to almost nothing. Then the Amen is said, everyone rises, the wall goes up again as if it had never wavered, the servants file out to their work and the family to their breakfast, and you gather your children and go up, or in, or wherever it is that you belong, which is to say, nowhere, which is to say, the schoolroom. But first, let us settle the great riddle of your position, the thing that will define every hour of every day, because it is the strangest arrangement in the whole strange machinery of the Victorian house, and no one who has not lived it ever quite believes it. You are neither one thing nor the other. You are not a servant. You do not take orders from the housekeeper. You do not clean or carry or cook. You dine off the family's china, and you speak the family's language, and you were born, very likely, to a better family than they were. And yet, you are not family either. You are paid. You have a wage, some £25 a year if you are lucky and experienced, less if you are young, and the moment money passes between two people in Victorian England, a wall goes up between them that all the good manners in the world cannot pull down. So you live in the crack between the two worlds of the house, belonging to neither, welcome in neither, and this is not cruelty, exactly. It is simply that no one has ever worked out where to put you, and so they put you nowhere. Consider the servants first, for they decide your comfort more than the family ever will. To the servants below stairs, you are a puzzle and, very often, a grievance. You give them extra work, for someone must carry coals to your room and hot water to your washstand and a tray to the schoolroom, and you cannot be tipped by visitors as they are, and you put on the airs of a lady while earning less than a good lady's maid. The cook may let your dinner go cold on the way up. The footman may forget your fire. The lady's maid, who dresses the mistress in silk and knows every secret of the house, will look straight through you on the stair as though you were a draught. None of them will be openly rude, for you might carry a complaint to the mistress, but the cold small punishments of a servants' hall are a fine and subtle art, and you will taste them all. And you may not befriend them either, for to sit gossiping in the kitchen would be to forget your rank, and your rank, threadbare as it is the only thing you have. So you are alone above stairs and alone below, and the loneliness of the governess became so famous, so universally understood, that it filled 100 novels and 1,000 real diaries, all saying the same quiet thing. There is no one in this house I may talk to as an equal, because there is no one in this house who is my equal, and that is the whole trouble. And yet, my friend, let me be fair to the house, for it is not all frost, and a person cannot live on frost alone. There are small warmths smuggled in at the edges, if you have the wit to receive them without presuming upon them. There is the nursemaid, young Susan, who shares the care of the children, and is far beneath you in rank and station, and has no learning at all, and yet who is nearer to a friend than anyone else under this roof, because you labor together over the same small runny noses and the same lost mittens, and a shared child is a kind of shared secret. She would never sit at your table nor you at hers, but she brings your tray up sometimes with a real word and a real smile, and once, when you were ill, she sat with you an hour, and you have not forgotten it. And there is the old housekeeper, Mrs. Denton, who has ruled the below stairs of this house for 30 years, and has seen governesses come and governesses go, dozens of them, a whole procession of gray gowns through the decades, and who therefore regards you with something that is not quite warmth, but is a very great deal like understanding. She keeps back a better cut of the cold meat for your tray. She sees that your fire is not entirely forgotten on the bitter nights. She says little, but she is buried, in her long service, a governess or two, quietly, decently, when there was no one else to do it, and she looks at you sometimes with an expression you cannot read but that you suspect is pity, the pity of a woman who has watched your exact kind of hope wear thin over many years. You take these small kindnesses gratefully, and you do not lean on them, for the moment you lean, they will have to withdraw, and you both know it, and so you keep the careful distance that lets the kindness survive. And the family, above you? With the family it is subtler still, and it turns on a single invisible line drawn through the middle of the house, and the line is drawn at meals. Where you eat, and with whom, is the entire question of your existence answered 3 times a day. In some households you eat in the schoolroom, alone, a tray brought up and taken away, and this is lonely, but at least it is honest. In others you dine with the children and the nursery, which is warmer but marks you plainly as a superior sort of nurse. And in others still, the grandest and the most agonizing, you are permitted to dine downstairs with the family, and this, my friend, is where the true torture of the situation lives. For at that table you must be present but not prominent, educated but not clever, agreeable but never gay, and above all you must never, ever forget for one instant that you are there on sufferance. You do not begin a subject of conversation, you follow one. You do not laugh loudly at the master's joke, nor fail to smile at it. If a real guest arrives, a neighbor, a titled visitor, you may be sent back up to the schoolroom without a word, your place at the table quietly needed by someone who matters, and you must rise and go as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and not let a single feeling show upon your face. You learn to eat quickly and speak little, and want nothing that is offered slowly, and you learn that the most crowded room in the world is a dinner table where you are tolerated but not wanted. But the bell is ringing again, and the children will not teach themselves. So let us go, you and I, up the back stairs to the one kingdom in this house where you are, for a few hours a day, something very like a queen. The schoolroom sits at the top of the house, plain and bright, and the moment you step into it your spine straightens and something in you comes alive, because here, and truly only here, you matter. Here is the long deal table scored with the initials of children long grown, and the tall cupboard of battered books, and the great terrestrial globe on its wooden stand, its oceans gone yellow with age, which you will spin to show your pupils where the tea comes from and where the empire is colored pink. Here is the map of Europe on the wall, its borders already a little out of date, for kingdoms will not hold still. Here is the piano, an old cottage piano slightly out of tune in its upper register, on which small fingers will murder Clemini every afternoon until the end of time. Here is the fire, at last a proper fire, for the children must be kept warm even if the governess need not, and you will stand in front of it gratefully in the mornings and pretend the warmth is entirely for them. And here, on the stroke of the appointed hour, arrive your subjects, scrubbed and fed and delivered up by the nursemaid, 3 of them, and you look at them, and they look at you, and the long negotiation that is your whole working life begins again where it left off yesterday. There is Miss Georgiana, who is 11 and clever and difficult, and who has already worked out, with a child's terrible instinct, exactly what you are and are not. She has learned somewhere, perhaps from her mother's cool tone, perhaps from the servants, that you may be disobeyed with very little consequence. For what can a governess truly do? She cannot punish severely, for a bruised or weeping child would be blamed upon you. She cannot appeal too often to the parents, for a governess who cannot manage children is a governess who will soon be dismissed. So Georgiana tests the fence at every hour, and you must hold your ground with nothing but patience, and cleverness, and a kind of moral stubbornness, and the strange authority of someone who has decided, quite simply, not to be beaten. It is the hardest thing you do all day, harder than the Latin, harder than the loneliness, and no one will ever thank you for it. Then there is Master Freddy, who is 7 and cheerful and wriggling and cannot be still for the length of a psalm, and who loves you without complication in the way small boys do, and who will one day be sent away to school and forget you entirely, though you will not forget him. And there is little Miss Clara, who is 5, and who sits close to your skirts and slips her small warm hand into yours during the reading, and it is for the sake of Clara's hand, on the worst days, that you do not walk out of the front door, and down the drive, and away forever. Now, what do you teach them, in this bright cold room, hour upon hour? A great deal, and most of it beautiful, and much of it useless, and that too is by design, for you are not raising scholars. You are manufacturing accomplishments. A young lady of this class must grow up able to do a great many charming things a little, and no single thing too well, for to be truly expert at anything would smell faintly of the professional, of trade, of a woman who might need to earn, and that would never do. So you teach the girls French, and a little Italian, so that they may sprinkle a phrase into their letters and understand the words on a concert program. You teach them to play the piano and to sing, well enough to entertain a drawing-room after dinner, but never so brilliantly as to seem to be showing off. You teach them to draw and to paint in watercolors, ruins and roses and picturesque cottages, and to dance, and to hold their backs straight, sometimes with a board laced against the shoulders, for deportment is half of being a lady. You teach them fine needlework and the working of samplers, plain sewing so they may direct a maid, and the keeping of household accounts. You teach them geography with the yellow globe, and a gentle sanded history of kings and dates, and enough arithmetic to manage a housekeeper, and not one some more, and a great deal of scripture, for piety in a woman was thought lovelier than learning. You do all of it with the plainest of tools, and you know each one as a soldier knows his kit. There is the backboard, a flat length of wood laced against a slouching girl's shoulders for an hour a day until she learns to sit as straight as a taper, uncomfortable, unarguable, and wholly ordinary in its time. There are the two globes side by side on their stands, the terrestrial with its empire colored pink, and the celestial scattered with its gods and beasts, on which you trace the trade winds with one finger and the winter constellations with another. There is your own soft-worn copy of Mangnall's Questions, that famous little catechism of facts from which a whole generation of English children learned, in strict question and dutiful answer, the kings and the rivers and the dates, so that a girl might know the capital of Sweden without ever once being troubled by why it should matter. And there are the samplers, on which small fingers stitch the alphabet and the numbers, and a solemn little verse about industry, or about the shortness of life, in colored wool, to be framed and kept forever, a whole childhood year of patience hanging quietly on a wall. And here is the exquisite irony that sits at the very center of your life, the irony that will not let you sleep some nights. To be worth employing, you must be more accomplished than the ladies you are creating. You must speak better French, play better music, know more history and more geography and more of the world than the mother of the house herself, or you would not be worth your £25. And yet all that superior learning has bought you nothing but this cold room at the top of a stranger's house. You are the most educated woman under this roof, and the least free, and you teach the daughters of the house the very accomplishments that will win them the safe married lives you will almost certainly never have. You dip the pen, you rule the copybook, you say, again, Georgiana, and this time with feeling, and you do not let the irony show in your voice. It never shows in your voice. That is the discipline of it. And here is a thing the advertisements never mention, tucked into the small print of your life, which is that teaching, exhausting as it is only the half of what you do. For a governess, in most houses, is understood to be generally useful, that dreadful phrase, and generally useful means whatever there is that no one else has time for. There is the mending. Oh, the mending! In the evenings, when the lessons are done, and you might dream of an hour to yourself, there arrives a basket, and in the basket is the family's plain sewing, the children's torn pinafores, the hemming of sheets, the endless small repairs of a great household, and you sew, because your hands are idle, and a governess with idle hands is a scandal, and because it was somehow understood, though never quite stated, that this too was part of your £20. Charlotte Brontë herself, whom you will meet in full tonight, wrote home in something close to despair about the mountains of sewing heaped upon her by a mistress, who seemed to think a governess a kind of superior sewing machine that could also parse a Latin sentence. There are the small errands, the notes to be written, the flowers to be arranged when the lady has a headache, the accounts to be cast up, the younger children to be watched on the afternoon the nursemaid has her half-day, the reading aloud to the mistress when her eyes are tired, the being on call, always, at every hour, for whatever the house requires, so that you are never truly off duty from the moment you wake to the moment you climb the last stair at night. You are teacher, seamstress, nurse, secretary, and companion, 5 women's work for 1 woman's wage, and the wage, let us remember, is 20 pounds. You thread the needle by the failing light. You do not complain. Complaint is a luxury, and we have already established that you cannot afford luxuries. And is there no rest at all, you may be wondering, no scrap of the week that is your own? There is, a little, and it is precious out of all proportion to its size. There is Sunday, when the whole household goes to church, walking or driving down to the grey country church among the yews, and you go with the children, and for the length of the service you sit in the great box pew or just behind it, and let the old words wash over you, and there is a kind of rest in that, in being, for an hour, simply one more soul among many under the same high roof, no better and no worse. And there is, if your family is a generous one, which not all are, a half-day now, and then that belongs to you, an afternoon in the week when the children are given over to the nursemaid and you may, for a few hours, be nobody's governess. And what do you do with such a treasure? Very little, and that is the whole sweetness of it. You walk, alone, farther than the children's short legs ever let you go, out along the lanes where no one knows you, and no one needs you, and you need not compose your face for anyone. You sit under a tree with a book that you chose, not a lesson book, a real book, your own thoughts your own for an afternoon. You write the letters you truly mean, or you write nothing, and simply watch the clouds go over, and remember that you are a person, a whole separate person, and not only a function of other people's needs. Perhaps you walk into the little town and spend a few carefully hoarded pennies on a ribbon you will never dare to wear, or a paper of sweets, or a pot of tea in a shop where the girl calls you madam, and does not know you are only a governess. And then the light begins to slant, and the hour turns, and you fold your small freedom away as neatly as you folded the wanting, and you walk back toward the great house whose windows are already lighting, and you become, at the gate, a governess once more. But you had your afternoon, and like the quarter hour on the frozen lawn, you have learned to make it last a whole week. But we must talk about the mistress of the house, for she is the sun and the weather of your whole existence, and by comparison the master, whom we shall come to, is only a passing storm. She engaged you. She interviewed you in the cold drawing-room, looking you over as one looks over a horse, asking after your accomplishments and your principles and your health, and, most searchingly of all, satisfying herself upon the one point that mattered more than French or piano, which was that you were plain enough, quiet enough, and sensible enough to bring no trouble into her house. And now she reigns over you with a politeness so cool and so complete that it is very nearly a form of frost. She is not cruel. Cruelty would be a kind of attention, and attention is the one thing she will never quite pay you. She simply does not see you, or sees you the way one sees a useful piece of furniture, and speaks to you in the tone one uses to a superior servant, kind enough, but from a great height. She comes to the schoolroom to inspect, and under her gaze the children grow stiff, and you grow careful, and she finds, always, some small thing. Clara's sampler is behind. Georgiana's accent is not quite Parisian. The girls were seen running on the lawn, and a lady does not run. And you receive each observation with a bowed head and a steady, and it shall be attended to, madam, and you do not defend yourself, for the governess who defends herself is the governess who does not understand her position. And beneath all her coolness there runs, sometimes, a thin cold current of something else, something she would never name, and you must never notice, and it is this. She is a little afraid of you. Not of your temper, nor your ambition, but of the simple fact of you, a younger woman, an educated woman, living under her roof, near her children, and, though you dress like a shadow, and keep your eyes down, near her husband. It is the fear that runs through 1,000 of these houses like a hairline crack through a wall, and it is the reason for half the coldness and all the drab gray gowns. So she watches you, in a way she is not even fully aware of, and you feel the watching, and you make yourself smaller, and plainer, and quieter still, so that she may be reassured, so that you may keep your place, so that little Clara's warm hand may go on finding yours during the morning reading. It is a strange dance. The two of you, the mistress and the governess, performed in silence and half smiles and observations gently made and gently received, and it goes on every single day, and neither of you will ever say a true word to the other as long as you both shall live. And because you are invisible, my friend, because you are the furniture, you see everything. That is the strange power of your powerless position, and the heaviest burden of it. You are present at the edges of this family's whole life, in the room, and not counted, and so you learn its secrets, all of them, the ones the servants only guess at, and the neighbors never dream of. You see that the master and the mistress, who are so gracious to their guests, scarcely speak to one another when the guests have gone, that a coldness lives between them like a third person at the table. You see the mistress cry once, quickly, turning to the window, and compose herself before she turns back, and you look down at the copybook and pretend, for her sake and your own, that you saw nothing. You come to know that the grand house is not so rich as it pretends, that there are worried conferences with a man of business, that certain bills are not paid, that the whole gilded performance is kept up over a quiet fear of money that would astonish the tenants who touch their hats to the family in the lane. You see which child is the favorite, and which is not, and it breaks your heart, for you love the unfavored one, and cannot say so. You are the keeper of 100 things you may never repeat, the confidant of no one and the witness of everything, and you carry the family's unspoken sorrows about the house along with your own, and set them down nowhere, and tell them to nobody, because a governess who gossiped would not last a week, and because, in the end, you are too kind. It is a lonely kind of knowing. But it is also, if you let it be, a school of compassion, for you learn, up there in your invisible corner, that the grandest life has its cold rooms too, that the mistress in her silk is not so free as she looks, that nearly everyone, above stairs and below, is carrying something heavy up a staircase of their own. The morning wears on, and the hours in the schoolroom have their own slow music, the scratch of pens, the murmur of the French verb recited, the sudden tears of a child who cannot make the sum come right, the small triumph when at last she can. You break for the children to take their bread and milk, and you take a cup of weak tea standing at the window, looking down at the park where the great trees are black and bare, and a gardener is barrowing leaves across the frozen grass. And at last, when noon is past and the light is at its thin best, comes the part of the day you love almost as much as you love little Clara, which is the walk. For the children must have air, rain or fine, and so must you. And you gather them into their coats and their boots and their comforters, a business of 20 minutes and lost gloves and complaints, and you lead them out into the enormous cold beautiful world of somebody else's estate. And oh, it is beautiful, and this is one of the small mercies smuggled into your hard life, that your prison has such lovely grounds. You walk the children down the avenue of limes, and around the frozen ornamental water where a single swan stands on one leg looking deeply offended by winter, and along the ha-ha, that clever sunk fence that lets the eye run on unbroken to the deer park beyond, so that the family, gazing from the windows, may feel they own the whole horizon. The children run ahead, their breath smoking, Freddie shouting, Clara stumbling, Georgiana pretending she is far too old for any of it, and then, forgetting herself entirely, running too, and for a quarter of an hour you are not a governess at all. You are simply a young woman in the cold, clean air with the wind pulling at your bonnet, and color whipping into your cheeks, and you tip your face up to the pale sun and feel, for one traitorous moment, almost happy. Then Freddie falls in the mud, and Clara begins to cry about her cold hands, and Georgiana says something pert, and you are a governess again, mopping and soothing and scolding gently, and you herd your small flock back toward the house, whose many windows watch you come. But you have had your quarter of an hour. You have learned, in this life, to live on quarter hours, and to be grateful, and to notice the swan. And walking there, in the cold bright grounds with the children scattered ahead of you, your mind does the thing it always does when your hands are free, which is to slip its leash and run backward to before. For you were not always a governess, my friend. You were a girl once, in a house that was your own or your father's, which felt like the same thing. There was a parlor with a fire that was lit for you as much as for anyone, and a garden you knew every corner of, and a piano, and it was your piano, and you played it not to teach, but for the pure foolish joy of the noise. There was a mother who did your hair, and a father who called you by a soft name that no one has used since, and there were plans for you, ordinary happy plans, that you would grow up and marry someone kind, and have a parlor of your own with a fire lit for you as much as for anyone. And then the plans came apart, quietly, the way they do, a death, a debt, a failure, a lawyer's letter, and the house was let, and the piano was sold, and the soft name went into the ground with the person who used it, and you were a lady still, but a lady with nothing, which is the most useless thing in England to be. So you notice, on your walk, that you know the names of all these trees, the lime and the beech and the great cedar, because someone taught you them long ago on another lawn that was yours, and you feel the old life pressing up under the new one like the grass under the frost, and you make yourself stop, because that way lies the self-pity you cannot afford, and you call the children in, and you go back to the house that belongs to somebody else. And there are the nights, too, that no advertisement warns you of, the nights when one of the children falls ill. It comes on suddenly, as it always does, a hot forehead in the afternoon, a fretful crying, and by dark little Clara is flushed and burning, and the doctor has been sent for down the frozen lanes, and the nursery is a fright of hot flannel and candlelight and low anxious voices. And where, in all this, is the mother? She looks in, pale and frightened, and she loves the child, make no mistake, but she has not the training of a sick-room nor, if we are honest, always the nerve for it, and it is you, in the end, who is left to sit up. It is you who bathes the small hot limbs, and changes the compress, and measures the medicine drop by careful drop, and holds the little body through the worst of the night when the fever climbs, and the child does not know you and cries out for her mamma, who is asleep 2 floors below. There is no bright science to lean upon, not really, only the old sickroom lore you have gathered from house to house, and you use every scrap of it. You lay a mustard poultice on the small chest to draw the fever out, and set a kettle steaming on the hob so the thick air may be a little easier to breathe, and you count the drops of the soothing draught into a spoonful of sugared water with a steady hand, though your own heart is anything but steady, for you know that too few drops will not quiet her, and too many can do a great and terrible harm, and the careful measuring of them, drop by candlelight, is a small act of courage. Repeat it a dozen times before dawn. You spoon a little beef tea between her cracked lips when at last she will take it. You wring the cloth out in cool water and lay it again upon the burning forehead, and again, 100 patient times. You sit in the one chair by the low fire with Clara's hot hand in yours, hour after hour, listening to her breathing, willing it to ease, and it is the most frightening and the most sacred duty of your whole strange life, for in this dark hour there is no rank at all, no wall, no wage, only a sick child and the one woman awake to keep watch over her, and that woman is you. And toward morning the fever breaks, all at once, the way it does, and the small forehead cools under your hand, and Clara sinks into a true sleep, deep and even, and you sit on in the gray dawn light too tired to move, and you understand something you can never say aloud, which is that you love this child as if she were your own, and that she will never be your own, and that both of those things are simply true and will remain true. And you carry them together, the love and the not having, out of the sickroom and down all the rest of the days. The afternoon in the schoolroom is softer than the morning, dedicated to the gentler accomplishments, and now the light comes low and golden through the tall window, and lies in long bars across the deal table, and you draw the lessons toward the arts. There is music, and you sit beside Georgiana on the piano bench and count her through the piece, 1 and 2 and 3, and she plays the same 4 bars wrong in the same 4 ways until, quite suddenly, and for no reason either of you will ever understand, she plays them right, and looks up at you astonished, and you both smile, and it is worth a great deal, that smile, more than the wages. There is drawing, and little Clara produces a horse that is manifestly a potato with legs, and you praise it with your whole heart and pin it to the wall. There is reading aloud, and you take up the book, and your voice, which has been so careful and so flat all day, is at last allowed to warm and rise and fall, and the children go still, even Georgiana, as you carry them off into the story, and in this one act, the telling of a tale in a firelit room to children who love you a little, you are entirely, unarguably good at your work, and you know it, and it is enough. The clock ticks toward the hour when the schoolroom will empty, and the long strange evening will begin. But before it does, before the light quite goes, there comes from far below, faint but unmistakable, the sound of the front door, and wheels on gravel, and a man's voice in the hall, and every nerve in your careful body goes still and listening. The master of the house has come home. Now I must be careful how I tell you this part, my friend, for it is the most delicate thread in the whole tapestry of your life, and it has been badly told 1,000 times. The master of the house is not a villain, and he is very likely not in love with you, and nothing of the smallest impropriety will occur, not tonight nor any night, for you would not permit it, and neither, most probably, would he. But he is the one person in this whole cold, careful household who occasionally, carelessly, treats you as though you were a person. He passes you on the stair and says good evening, and actually asks, how the children get on, and listens for a moment to your answer. At dinner, on the nights you are permitted to be there, he addresses a remark to you across the table, some small dry joke, and looks at you as he says it, and expects you to have a mind, and is not displeased when you turn out to have one. It is nothing. It is the merest common courtesy that any decent man might show to anyone. But you have been invisible for so long, poured out day after day into the endless needs of children who cannot see you and a mistress who will not, that the ordinary kindness of a grown man who meets your eyes and waits for your reply falls upon your starved heart like sunlight through a cellar grate, and you feel it. Heaven help you, you feel it more than you have any business feeling anything. And so you do the only thing a sensible woman in your position can do. You crush it. You take that small foolish warmth the moment you notice it, and you fold it up very small, and you put it away in the locked drawer at the back of your heart where you keep all the other things you may not have, and you turn the key, and you go on ruling the copybook with a hand that does not tremble. You are not a fool. You know exactly what you are, and exactly what he is, that between his position and yours there lies a gulf as wide as the whole English class system, and that a governess who forgets it for even a moment is a governess ruined, dismissed without a character, sent down the drive with her trunk and no reference and nowhere on this earth to go. You know that the mistress, who is a little afraid of you, is watching, always watching, and that a single warm look caught and misread would end you. So you are cool and correct, and you keep your eyes upon your work, and if your heart does a small quiet thing when his step sounds on the stair in the evening, well, that is your own private business, locked in your own private drawer, and no one in this house will ever know, and that is precisely how it must be. It is the whole tender ache of the governess told in a glance across a dinner table, this nearness to a fuller life, and this iron rule against reaching for it, and it is why, when a certain Yorkshire clergyman's daughter came to write the most famous of all governess stories, she gave her heroine the one thing real governesses almost never got, which was the ending where reaching out did not destroy her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and that story belongs to later tonight. For now, the children must go down to the drawing-room after their tea, scrubbed and curled, to be displayed to their parents for the golden half-hour before bed, and you are not invited, and you deliver them to the drawing-room door and turn away, and go up alone. Though not always alone, and here is a cruelty subtle enough to deserve its own moment, for there are evenings when you are summoned down, and it is somehow worse than being left out. It happens when there are guests, and the numbers are awkward, and a fourth is wanted at the card table, or the young ladies wish to dance an impromptu quadrille, and there is no one to play, or the company simply wants music while it digests its dinner, and someone remembers, as one remembers a useful object, that there is a governess upstairs who plays. And so the bell rings for you, and down you go, in your plain gray gown among the silks and the jewels, and you take your place at the piano in the corner, and you play, and you play, and you play, for as long as they wish to dance or talk over the music, and no one turns a page for you, and no one thanks you, and no one, above all, speaks to you, for you are not a guest, you are the music. You are a mechanism that happens to have a heartbeat. You watch, over the top of the instrument, the whole warm bright life of the drawing-room, the flirting and the laughing and the ease of people who have never once in their lives had to wonder where they belong, and you are 6 feet from it and 1,000 miles from it at the very same time, providing the very melody to which they are happy. And when they have had enough, the music is simply no longer required, and you are dismissed with a nod, or not even that, and you climb back up to your cold room with your ears still ringing, having been in the midst of the party, and never for one instant of it. Some governesses said they would rather 100 lonely trays than one evening as the furniture that plays. You understand exactly what they meant. For most nights, though, are the ordinary nights, and this is the loneliest hour of your day, the hour after the children have gone down and before they are brought up to bed, when the whole great house is lit and warm and full of life below, and you sit above it all in the cooling schoolroom with the fire dying and no one to speak to. You can hear it, that is the cruelty of it. You can hear the piano in the drawing-room and the murmur of voices and, once, a peal of the mistress's laughter, brighter and freer than any sound she ever makes to you, and you can hear the servants' hall below, distant, warm, a burst of talk, the scrape of chairs, all the easy human noise of people who belong somewhere, and you belong to neither, and you sit exactly between them in the silence, holding your cold cup. Your dinner comes up on a tray, if you dine alone tonight, and you eat it by the low fire, and it is not unkind food, but it is solitary food, and you have learned that a meal eaten entirely alone, night after night, hollows out something in a person that company would keep filled. And since we are sitting here in the quiet after supper, let us speak plainly, for one evening moment, about money, for it is the iron thread running under everything in your life, and you think of it far more than you would ever admit to a living soul. Your wage is paid to you 4 times in the year, upon the quarter days, and there is a small dreadful ceremony to it that never once grows easier. You are sent for, or the mistress comes up to the schoolroom with a folded paper or a little pile of sovereigns, and the money passes from her gloved hand into yours, and in that single instant, however kindly it is done, you are unmistakably a servant being paid, and you both feel it, and you say thank you in a voice you have practiced long and hard to keep perfectly level. Reckon the whole of it up, and it is a bitter little sum. A good cook in this very house may earn as much as you, or more, and she is fed and warmed and asks nobody's pardon for it, while your genteel £25 must somehow stretch across a whole year of being a lady. And it does not stretch, for there are the quiet deductions no one ever warned you of, a charge, in some houses, for your washing, for your tea and your sugar taken apart from the families, for the very candles that light your cold room, so that the figure on the paper is never quite the figure in your hand. Out of what is left you must clothe yourself respectably, which is dear, and by your own postage, and your own boots resoled, and your own small necessaries, and send home, always send home, the £1 or 2 your mother or your sister cannot do without. And when all of that is counted, there is nothing over, nothing to save, nothing at all laid by against the day, the Miss Pruitt day, when there will be no more quarters paid to you ever again. Other women your age are building homes, and filling linen chests, and laying down the small foundations of a settled life, and you are running very fast, in your neat darned gloves, only to stand still. There was, by your day, one thin net stretched under women like you, and you know of it, and you try not to think of it too often. In the early 1840s, some kind and clear-eyed people, seeing how many educated women were ending their days in real destitution, founded a society for the relief of governesses, and it did what it could, a small fund, a few annuities granted each year to the oldest and most desperate, and in time even a home where a handful of aged governesses might live out their last days in decency. It was a good work, and it saved some. But the annuities were pitifully few, and the applicants heartbreakingly many, so that the granting of them came down, in the end, to a kind of ballot, a vote among the charity's subscribers. And picture for one moment what that meant. It meant that a gentlewoman who had given 40 years of her life to other people's children might, at the very end of it, have to stand as a supplicant and be voted a pension, or not voted one, like a name drawn from a hat, her whole survival hanging on the passing charity of strangers who had never once met her. You have heard the older governesses speak of it, in low voices, at the edges of other people's parties. You put it firmly out of your mind. You are 23 and strong and useful, and it will not come to that for you, you tell yourself, and you fold the small sum that is left into the old tea caddy where you keep it, and you close the lid. That, too, is a kind thing to tell yourself, and kindness, tonight, is in short supply, so you may as well have a little of it from your own hand. So you do what governesses have always done in this hour. You take up your writing case, and you write home. You write to your mother, or your sister, or the old aunt in the small cathedral town who took you in the last time you were between places, and you dip the pen, and you make your life sound better than it is, because that is what you write home to do. You describe the beauty of the park, the cleverness of the children, the kindness. You write kindness, though the word costs you, of the family. You do not write about the cold water with its skin of ice, nor the cook who lets your dinner go cold, nor the maid who looks through you, nor the long hollow evenings, nor the master's step on the stair, above all not that. You keep your letter bright and dutiful and brave, and you enclose, if you can bear to spare it, a little of your small wage, folded into the paper, for you very often are the one supporting them now, the failed father's family, out of your £25 a year, and that too is the common lot of your kind. And when the letter is sealed and frank, you sit a while longer with the pen in your hand, and you let yourself, just for a moment, before you blow the candle out, want things. A home of your own, however small. A parlor with your own chair in it, and your own fire that no one begrudges you. Someone to talk to across a table who is neither your employer nor your pupil. Work that ends. A life that is yours. You want these things the way you have taught yourself never to want anything in daylight, fiercely and hopelessly, and then the schoolroom clock strikes, and it is time to bring the children up to bed, and you fold the wanting away with the writing case, and you rise, and you go. But before you rise, let me tell you why the wanting frightens you as much as it comforts you, for it has a face, that fear, and you have seen it. Some months ago, in your last situation, you met an older governess, a Miss Pruitt, 60 if she was a day, who had come to give the eldest girl her music when your own hands were full. She had been a governess her whole life, in house after house, 40 years of other people's children, and she was gentle and faded and exquisitely, painfully genteel, her one good gown brushed and mended into a kind of ghost of respectability, her manners perfect, her fingers, when she played, still lovely on the keys. And she was frightened. You could see it under the gentility, the way you can see the shape of a thing under a thin cloth. She had no home. She had no husband, no children of her own, no money laid by to speak of, for who could lay by anything from £20 a year while sending half of it home? And the children she had raised, all those children across all those years, were grown and scattered and had forgotten her, as children do, and the families had let her go, one by one, as the young ones outgrew the schoolroom, and now the situations came harder and harder, for who wants a governess with gray hair and tired eyes when there are so many fresh young ladies in plain gowns sitting in a row at the register office? She was living, between posts, in a single rented room in a cheap street, taking in a little sewing, a little copying, and she spoke of it lightly, brightly, the way you have taught yourself to speak of hard things, and it chilled you to the bone, because you were looking, you understood with perfect clarity, at yourself. At the far end of the very road you were walking now. And you were kind to her, of course, and you slipped her a small thing when you parted that she pretended not to need, and you have thought of her 100 times since, in the dark, at the top of the stairs. Miss Pruitt is the fear that has a face. And you fold it away too, with the writing case, because it is time to bring the children up. And here, at the very end of your day, in the last quiet task of it, is where I must leave you, my friend, for it is the truest picture of your whole life. You bring the children up from the drawing-room, sleepy and warm and smelling of the good fires below, and you hear their prayers, 3 small voices stumbling through the words, and you tuck them into their beds and turn down their lamps, and little Clara, half asleep, reaches up and puts her arms around your neck and calls you, in her drowsy muddle, by a name that is very nearly Mamma, and does not notice, and you do notice. You notice with your whole heart, and you say nothing, and you kiss her forehead, and you draw the door quietly to. Then you climb the last flight to your own cold plain room under the roof, and you light your single candle, and you sit down on the edge of the narrow bed, and there you are. The children are asleep and are not yours. The house is full and is not yours. The man whose kindness warms you is not yours and never can be. Your youth is spending itself, quietly, in the raising of other women's daughters, and you know, you have always known, the fear that waits at the end of this road, the fear every governess carries like a stone in her pocket, which is the fear of growing old at it, of the day the children are grown and gone and no new place can be found for a governess with gray in her hair, and of the cold thin genteel poverty that waits beyond that day. A rented room, a little sewing, a slow forgetting. That is the golden cage, my friend. Not bars, for you are free to walk out the door tomorrow into a world that has nowhere else to put you. It is comfort without belonging, and beauty without ownership, and a warm house full of people none of whom are yours, and a locked drawer in your heart, and a single candle at the top of the stairs. You blow it out. In the dark, before you sleep, you decide, as you decide every night, to be brave again tomorrow. And most of them were. Now let us go down, out of the schoolroom, and out of the year 1863, and let me tell you about 3 real women who lived this very life, and what love did to each of them, for the fire is still bright, and the night is still young. Long before she was the most famous novelist in England, she was a small, short-sighted, painfully shy governess who hated the work with all her heart. Her name was Charlotte Brontë, and she was born in 1816, the third of 6 children of an Irish clergyman, Patrick Brontë, in the bleak and beautiful moorland village of Haworth in Yorkshire. The parsonage where she grew up sat between the church and the graveyard, with the wild moors rising behind it, and it was a house marked early and often by death. Charlotte was only 5 when her mother died. Within a few years the 2 eldest Brontë sisters, sent away to a cheap and brutal school for clergymen's daughters, sickened there and died as well, and Charlotte, who was at that school too and survived it, never forgot the cold, the hunger, the cruelty, and the small coffins, and she would one day pour the whole of that grief and rage onto the page in a chapter that made Victorian England weep. What was left of the family drew together against the world. For children in a stone house at the edge of the moor, Charlotte, her brother Branwell, and her 2 younger sisters, Emily and Anne, and they invented between them entire imaginary kingdoms, wrote them down in tiny secret books in handwriting too small to read without a glass, and lived half their lives in worlds of their own making. It was the loneliness, you see, the same loneliness you have tasted tonight. It made them, all three sisters, into writers. But I must go back, for a moment, to those two eldest sisters who died, for their deaths are the buried root of everything Charlotte would later write, and they are worth your tears tonight. Their names were Maria and Elizabeth, the two little mothers of that motherless house, Maria especially, grave and clever and tender beyond her years, who tried to hold the small family together after their mother was gone. And their father, meaning only to do right by them, sent his four eldest girls away to a school for the daughters of poor clergymen, a cheap, cold, pious, cruel establishment at a place called Cowan Bridge, and it very nearly killed them all. The food was scorched and scanty, the rooms were freezing, the discipline was harsh and humiliating, and the damp and the hunger and the hard treatment fell hardest on the two eldest, already frail. Maria fell ill, and was treated not with tenderness, but with reproach, hauled from her sickbed and shamed before the school even as she was dying, and she was sent home at last only to die there, 11 years old. And within weeks Elizabeth followed her into the grave. Charlotte was 9. She had watched her two big sisters, her protectors, sicken and be broken by a cruel institution and carried home to die, and she never, ever forgot it, and 30 years later she took that whole frozen horror and set it down in Jane Eyre, in the school called Lowood, and in the saintly dying child called Helen Burns, who is Maria, drawn from the life, given back her gentleness on the page, so that the world might weep for her as Charlotte had wept. When the book came out and people asked whether such a school could really have existed, whether any place could truly have been so cruel to little girls, Charlotte said only that she had toned it down, if anything, for fear no one would believe the truth. So you see, my friend, before Charlotte Brontë was ever a governess, before she was ever in love, she was a small girl in a cold dormitory learning the first great lesson of her life, which is how much a gentle soul can be made to suffer, and how a survivor carries the dead inside her, and writes. But imagination does not pay the butcher, and the Brontës were poor, and there was no money to keep 3 grown daughters at home. And so Charlotte, like you, my friend, faced the one narrow door open to a poor gentlewoman, and walked through it, and hated every step. She became a governess. She took a post with a family called the Sidgwicks, and then another with a family called the Whites, and her letters home from these places are among the most honest and heartbroken records of the governess life ever written, because Charlotte, unlike the brave, dutiful letter writer I described to you, told her sister the truth. She wrote of the misery of it, the crushing loads of sewing piled upon her, the children she found spoiled and unmanageable, the sense of being a nonentity, a nothing, a piece of the furniture that happened to teach French. I see now more clearly than I have ever done, she wrote, that a private governess has no existence, is not considered as a living rational being except as connected with the wearisome duties she has to fulfill. She was proud, and clever, and fiercely alive inside, and the position asked her to be humble, and invisible, and dead to her own feelings, and it very nearly broke her. And out of that exact experience, the not being seen, the not existing, would come, a few years later, the most quietly revolutionary heroine in English literature, a small plain governess, who looks a wealthy man in the eye and declares that she has a soul and a heart the equal of his own. There was, in these hard years, one thread of pure gold, and it was friendship. At school, this time a kinder school called Roe Head, where she went as a pupil and later returned as a teacher, Charlotte had made two friends who would matter all her life, and one of them, a steady, sensible, warm-hearted girl named Ellen Nussey, became her dearest confidant for the rest of her days. And because Charlotte wrote to Ellen faithfully for decades, pouring out her heart in letter after letter, we know Charlotte Brontë from the inside, as we know almost no other woman of her century, her jokes and her despairs, and her fierce opinions, and her loneliness, all of it preserved because one friend kept the letters. It was in her teaching years at Roe Head, standing before a schoolroom of other people's dull daughters while her own imagination burned to write, that Charlotte tasted the particular torment of the gifted governess most sharply, the sense of her real self, her writing self, being slowly smothered under the endless grinding duty of teaching, of her mind, made for creation, being spent on drilling facts into children who did not care. She confided to Ellen and to her secret diary a kind of anguish at it, the feeling that her true life was leaking away hour by hour in a schoolroom. And still, at night, in stolen minutes, she and her sisters wrote, always wrote, filling those tiny secret books with the grand doomed passions of imaginary kingdoms, keeping the inner fire alive on almost nothing, which is a thing every one of us who has ever had a dream and a day job may understand in our bones. But before that, before the book, there came Brussels, and there came love, and it broke her worse than the governessing ever had. For Charlotte and her sister Emily, wishing to open a school of their own one day, went abroad in 1842 to improve their languages, to a boarding school in Brussels run by a married couple, the Hegers. And there, in the classroom, Charlotte met the master of the school, Constantine Heger, a brilliant, temperamental, magnetic teacher of literature, a small dark man with a quick mind and a quicker temper, who saw at once that this shy, plain, short-sighted English girl had a mind like a banked fire, and who taught her, and challenged her, and argued with her, and set that fire roaring. He was married. His wife ran the school and was, by every account, perfectly kind to Charlotte. There was never the smallest impropriety, not a word, not a touch, nothing but a teacher and his most gifted pupil in a classroom full of other girls. And Charlotte Brontë fell in love with him with the whole of her starved and powerful heart, the way only a lonely woman of enormous depth and no experience can fall, hopelessly, silently, and forever. It was the governess's ache exactly, the same one you locked in your drawer tonight, the nearness of a man who treated her mind as real, and the iron wall of circumstance that made it impossible. She went home to Haworth, and from Haworth, across the sea, she wrote to Monsieur Heger letters of longing so naked and so painful that they are almost unbearable to read now. Day and night I find neither rest nor peace, she wrote to him. If I sleep, I have tormenting dreams in which I see you always severe, always grave, always incensed against me. He did not write back, or barely, and told her to write less often, and at last not at all. The worst of it, and the making of it, was the second year, for Emily grew homesick and went back to Yorkshire, and Charlotte, alone now in that foreign city, stayed on, and the loneliness closed over her like water. She had no friend, no sister, no one, only the school and the crowded classrooms and, at the burning center of her days, the one man whose approval she lived for and could not have. He had a way of teaching that suited her exactly, setting her to write compositions, essays, and then going over them with her, line by line, praising, cutting, arguing, taking her mind seriously as no one ever had, and to a woman starved of exactly that, it was food and drink and air. She began to wait for those hours, as one waits for the single warm thing in a cold day. She read meaning into his kindness, and perhaps there was a little meaning there, a teacher's genuine delight in a rare pupil, but no more than that, never any more than that, and the gulf between what she felt and what could ever be answered grew into a private agony she carried alone through the long Brussels winter. She wandered the city in her free hours. She wrote in a fever, and once, in her extremity, this daughter of a Protestant parson walked into a great Catholic cathedral and, not knowing what else to do with the weight in her heart, made confession to a priest, a stranger, simply to speak aloud to one human being the thing she could tell no one. She put that very scene, years later, into a novel, for she wasted nothing, this woman. She turned every wound into a book. She went home at last, in retreat, defeated, and the love came home with her and would not leave. And it is from that exact grief, the educated woman's hopeless love for a man forever beyond her reach, that the greatest governess story in the world was quarried. And here the story does a strange and moving thing, a thing that reaches down the years to us. Monsieur Heger tore her letters up and threw them away. But his wife, Madame Heger, found the torn pieces in the wastepaper basket, and instead of destroying them, she did something extraordinary. She smoothed out the fragments, and she sewed and stitched them carefully back together, and she kept them, for years, for decades, and because she did, those letters survive to this day, folded and torn and mended, in a great museum in London, so that we may read exactly how much a lonely governess in 1844 could love a man she could never have. Why did Madame Heger save them? No one truly knows. Perhaps as evidence, should there ever be a scandal. Perhaps out of some deep female understanding that these torn pages were the truest thing in that whole schoolhouse, and ought not to be lost. We will never know. But because of her, we have them, and because of them, we know that the coolest, most controlled heroine in Victorian fiction was written by a woman who knew from the inside exactly what it was to love in silence and be answered with silence, and to go on. For she went home, and she buried the love, and she took the pain, and she made it into a book. In 1847, under the man's pen name Currer Bell, for a woman could not easily be a novelist then, Charlotte Brontë published Jane Eyre, the story of a poor, plain, orphan governess, who comes to a lonely great house called Thornfield to teach the ward of a dark, difficult, magnetic master named Mr. Rochester, and who falls in love with him, and he with her, and who, when everything conspires to destroy it, refuses to become less than she is, and declares to him, in the most famous speech in the book, that though she is poor and obscure and plain, she is not soulless and heartless, that she has as much heart as he, and that they stand before God as equals. It was a thunderclap. Nobody had ever heard a governess, a nobody, a piece of the furniture, speak like that. The book sold and sold, and all London wondered who this Currer Bell could be, and when at last it came out that the author was a tiny, quiet, unmarried clergyman's daughter from a remote Yorkshire village, the very woman who had lived the life she wrote, the wonder only grew. She had taken the loneliest, most invisible position a woman could hold, and she had made the whole world see it, and see her. And the manner of it, the way the book came to be, is a small marvel in itself, and worth the telling as the fire burns down. For back home in Haworth, the three grown sisters were all secretly writing, each barely aware how far the others had gone, until one day Charlotte, prying a little as sisters do, came upon a notebook of Emily's poems, and read them, and knew at once, with a shock, that they were not the ordinary verses of an accomplished young lady, but something strange and wild and genuinely great. Emily was furious to have been read. But Charlotte, who had the practical fire of the three, coaxed and argued and would not let it go, and at last persuaded her sisters that they should publish together a little book of their poems. And because a woman who wrote was thought unladylike, was patronized or leered at or simply not taken seriously, the three sisters hid themselves behind three men, or three names that might be men, keeping their own initials, Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, Charlotte and Emily Ann N. The book of poems came out and sold, in all the world, 2 copies. 2. But they had tasted print, and they did not stop, and each turned to a novel, and the parcels of manuscript went out to the London publishers and came back, and went out again, refused and refused, all but Charlotte's first, a quiet book called The Professor that no one would take at all. And then one publisher, refusing The Professor, added a kind line, that if the author had a longer, more exciting tale, he would gladly consider it. And Charlotte had one, nearly finished, poured out of all her Brussels grief and all her governess years. It was Jane Eyre. She sent it. He read it in a sitting, could not put it down, and published it, and it made her famous within weeks, while no one in the world knew that Currer Bell was a tiny Yorkshire spinster. And when at last a muddle arose, a rumor that all the Bell books were by one hand, Charlotte and Gentle, and did a thing that must have terrified them both, 2 shy countrywomen who had scarcely left the moor. They put on their plain bonnets, and travelled overnight to London, and walked into the offices of Charlotte's astonished publisher, and announced that they were Currer and Acton Bell, 2 separate women, sisters, come to prove it. The great man could hardly believe that these small, quiet, dowdily dressed provincial ladies were the authors setting all London ablaze. But they were. And I must tell you, too, of the brother, for his shadow lies across the whole of Charlotte's story, and darkens the very years of her triumph. Branwell Brontë, the only boy, had been the great hope of the family, the one on whom all the ambitions rested, brilliant, charming, gifted in a dozen directions, the golden child who was to make the Brontë name. And he failed, at everything, one thing after another, a painter who did not become a painter, a tutor dismissed in disgrace, a railway clerk let go, and the failure ate into him, and he took to drink, and then to worse than drink, to the opium that was sold in every chemist's shop, and he sank, over years, before his sister's eyes, from the family's brightest promise into its heaviest sorrow, raving and weeping in the night, running up debts, breaking their father's heart and their own. And here is the bitter irony at the center of it. While the boy on whom everything had been staked crumbled into ruin, the 3 overlooked sisters, the quiet plain girls of whom little had been expected, were quietly becoming immortal, writing in the same house, at the same table, some of the greatest novels in the English language, and hiding the whole of it from him, so as not to wound what was left of his pride. The great genius of that family turned out to be the daughters all along. But there was no triumph in it for them, only grief, for they loved him, and they watched him die by inches, and when he went at last it was the first stone of the avalanche that would bury them all. And here is a thing about Charlotte that the world, knowing only the burning letters to Monsieur Heger, too easily forgets, which is how carefully she had guarded her own heart before that, and how firmly she had refused, more than once, to marry merely in order to be safe. For she had her chances, in those early governess years, and she turned them down. When she was but 23, the brother of her dearest friend Ellen, a respectable young clergyman, wrote and proposed marriage to her coolly, sensibly, a suitable match that would have made her a parson's wife, with a settled home of her very own, the exact rescue every governess was told to pray for. And Charlotte, who had every practical reason under heaven to say yes, said no, and wrote to Ellen the truth of it with startling honesty, that she did not love him, that he did not truly know her at all, that she was not the calm, mild, conventional helpmeet he imagined, but a woman of fire and oddity, who would only make such a man wretched, and that she would sooner keep her own difficult, restless self than be comfortably married into a lie. And then, within that same strange year, it happened again, more astonishing still. A young Irish curate, in the country only briefly, met Charlotte just the once, was quite carried away by her, and a few days later sent her by post an ardent proposal of marriage, having scarcely spoken a dozen sentences to her in his life. She laughed over it, a little kindly, a little bewildered, and refused him too, and the poor impetuous young man died of a sudden fever not many months after, so that the whole odd episode crossed her life like a small brief comet and was gone. Twice, then, before she was 25, this plain and penniless governess had been offered the safe harbor of marriage, and twice she had turned away from it, not out of coldness, but out of a fierce, almost frightening honesty, a flat refusal to give herself where she did not love. She would wait, though the waiting cost her everything, and in the waiting she would learn from the inside exactly what it is to want and not to have, and she would pour the whole of it, the honesty, and the loneliness, and the long unrewarded patience, into a small governess who stands before a rich man and tells him that she is a free human being with an independent will. Charlotte Brontë had earned that line the hard way, one refused proposal at a time. But her own life, my friend, did not have the ending she gave to Jane. That is the part that catches in the throat. Fame came, but so did more death, unrelenting, unbearable. Within a single terrible year her brother Branwell died, and then her sister Emily, the fierce, untamable genius who wrote Wuthering Heights, and then her sister Anne, the gentle one who had also been a governess and written of it, and Charlotte was left entirely alone with her aging father in the parsonage between the church and the graves, the last of 6 children, the survivor, walking the empty rooms where all her collaborators in that childhood kingdom had been. She was famous now, and she went sometimes to London and met the great writers of the day, and they were in awe of her, and she was still shy, and small, and lonely, and came home always to Haworth and the wind on the moor. And then, late, and quietly, and against her father's wishes, real love did come to her, not grand, not romantic in the way of her novels, but true. Arthur Bell Nichols, her father's curate, a steady, undramatic, deeply devoted Irishman who had loved her in silence for years, at last spoke, and after long hesitation she married him in 1854, and to her own surprise she was happy, genuinely happy, cared for and cherished in a way her whole starved life had never allowed. It lasted 9 months. She grew pregnant and fell gravely ill, wasting away with the sickness of the pregnancy, and in the spring of 1855, not yet 39 years old, with her new husband praying at her bedside, Charlotte Brontë died, and her unborn child with her. Her last words were whispered to him. "I am not going to die, am I?" she is said to have murmured. "We have been so happy." She had waited her whole life to be happy, and been given a single season of it, and then it was taken too. But the plain little governess, who felt she had no existence, had, without ever meaning to, made herself immortal, and given every lonely woman who ever taught another woman's children a heroine, who looked the world in the eye and refused to be nothing. Rest on that, my friend, as the fire settles, and let me carry you now much farther away, to the other side of the world, to a palace of 100 wives and 1,000 children, and a young widow with a schoolroom in the middle of it all. Long before she was a legend of the stage and the screen, before the songs and the whirling skirts, she was a real and rather mysterious young widow with a little boy to feed, and no money to feed him with, and her name was Anna Leonowens. And the truth of her, my friend, is stranger and sadder and braver than any story ever made of her, and she told a good deal of it wrong on purpose, and we shall never be entirely sure which parts, and that is part of what makes her wonderful. She was born in 1831, in India, in the world of the British Army there, and this is the first of her secrets. For all her life she would tell people she was Welsh, born in Wales of good family, and it was not true. She was of humbler and more mixed origins than that, born into the ordinary ranks rather than the gentry, and in the cruel snobbish arithmetic of the Victorian Empire that background could sink a woman socially without trace. So she buried it. She invented herself a genteel Welsh childhood, cast off the truth of where she came from, and became, by sheer force of will and cleverness, the elegant, cultivated, unmistakably ladylike Mrs. Leonowens whom the world would later know. It was, in its way, the ultimate governess's trick, the manufacturing of a lady, only she performed it upon herself. And she made herself a good one, that is the thing, for whatever the truth of her birth, the woman who emerged was genuinely learned, genuinely accomplished, genuinely formidable of mind. As a girl and a young woman, she seems to have traveled widely through the East, picking up languages and manners, and a great store of knowledge about the wider world beyond England, so that by the time she stepped into her role, she truly could speak of Egypt and India and the customs of a dozen peoples, and hold her own with scholars and princes. She was clever, and curious, and brave in the plain physical way that a woman alone in the 19th century had to be brave, and she had that particular hard brightness that poverty and precariousness grind into a person who refuses to be crushed by them. She had learned, young, that the world would give her nothing, that she had no family fortune to fall back upon, no powerful name, no safety net of any kind, and that whatever she got she would have to seize with her own two hands and her own quick wits. It is the making of an adventuress, that lesson, in the old grand sense of the word, a woman who must adventure because she has no other means, and Anna became one of the great ones, though she always dressed it in the sober gray of the perfect gentlewoman, which was, of course, the cleverest disguise of all. The great love of her real life, the one that films half forget, was not a king at all. It was a young man named Thomas Leonowens, whom she married as a girl in India, a clerk, a paymaster, a man of no fortune but, it seems, of real tenderness, and she loved him wholly. They had children, and buried some, as so many did in that climate, and clung to the two who lived, and moved about the East as his poor employments took them, and she was, for a handful of years, an ordinary young wife in love. And then, in 1859, out in the Malay world, Thomas died, suddenly, leaving her a widow of but 28 with 2 small children and almost nothing in the world. And here is the true beginning of her legend, not a romance but a catastrophe, a young woman alone at the edge of the empire with children to keep and only one asset to her name, which was that she was educated, and spoke well, and could pass, entirely, for a lady. She did what you did tonight, my friend. She opened the one door available to her. She would teach. And do not pass too quickly over what that widowhood truly was, for it is the hinge on which her whole life swung, and it was terror, not romance. Picture her, 28 years old, in a hot far country at the edge of everything, her young husband suddenly dead, 2 small children looking up at her, and the money, what little there was, gone or going. She had no one to turn to, no father to take her in, no brother to write to for passage home, nothing but herself. And she made, in that dark hour, the hardest decision a mother can make, which was to part with her children in order to save them, sending her little daughter Avis home across the world to be educated safely in England, keeping only her small son Louis by her side, so that she might go wherever the work was and earn what she could. That is the choice the films leave out, the mother putting a child on a ship for the far side of the earth, and turning back to her own hard road with dry eyes, because tears would not buy bread. She grieved, and she worked, and she taught the officers' children their letters in Singapore, and she waited, in that way that women in her position learned to wait, for something, anything, that might lift her a rung up out of the pit. And then, up the river, in a palace she could not have imagined, a scholar king was looking for exactly such a woman as she had made herself into. She opened a little school in Singapore for the children of the British officers, and it was there, in 1862, that the offer came that would make her immortal. The King of Siam, the land we now call Thailand, was a remarkable and formidable man named Mongkut, a king who had spent 27 years as a Buddhist monk before he came to the throne, a scholar of astronomy and languages, who saw with unusual clarity that the great Western empires were pressing in upon his kingdom from every side, and who had resolved that Siam would survive not by fighting them, which was hopeless, but by understanding them. He wanted his many children, and he had a great many children, some scores of them, and his wives, educated in the English language and Western learning, so that the next generation of Siamese royalty could meet the West with open eyes. And so he sent to Singapore for an English governess. And Anna Leonowens, widow, 31, packed up her small son Louis, left her daughter safely at school in England, and sailed up the muddy river to Bangkok, into the walled and forbidden inner city of the royal palace, to teach the children of a king. And she brought her little boy with her into all of it, small Louis, a British child of perhaps 6 or 7, suddenly set down in the most exotic place on earth, and the two of them clung to each other, the widow and her son, through those first bewildering weeks, the only two of their kind for 1,000 miles. The heat pressed down like a hand. The river carried its cargo of temple bells, and cooking smoke, and the cries of a language she did not yet know. There was a struggle from the very first day, for the king had meant to lodge her inside the palace among the women, and she, English to the bone and stubborn as iron, insisted upon a house of her own outside the walls, a place where she and Louis might close a door and be, for a few hours, simply themselves, and she won that fight, the first of many, though it took her weeks of polite immovable insistence against the will of an absolute monarch. And each morning she left her small English house, and passed through the great gates into the other world, the world of the inner court, walking with her books to a schoolroom set in the middle of a hidden city of women and children, to begin the strangest teaching post any Englishwoman ever held. Imagine it, for it is worth imagining slowly as you drift. She came from the great cold governess world you have lived tonight, the drab gown and the schoolroom fire, into a place of almost unimaginable strangeness and splendor, a vast walled palace city gleaming with gilded spires and colored glass, elephants in the streets, the scent of jasmine and incense and river mud, and within the innermost wall the veiled and forbidden quarter, where the king's wives and daughters, and their thousands of attendant women lived, a whole hidden city of women into which no grown man but the king might ever go, and into which this small determined Englishwoman now walked every day with her books and her globe. She set up her schoolroom in the heart of it and taught, and it was hard, harder than any English post, for she was foreign, and Protestant, and stubborn, and forever colliding with a court whose ways she only half understood and often disapproved of, and the king himself, brilliant and imperious and quick-tempered, both valued her and clashed with her, summoning her at strange hours to take his English dictation, arguing with her over words and customs, this proud scholar-king and this proud governess-widow, two strong wills meeting across the widest gulf on earth. And out of that, and only that, the argumentative, respectful, exasperated meeting of two clever minds from opposite ends of the world, later ages would spin a great and glittering love story. There was, so far as any sober history can tell, no romance between Anna and the King of Siam. The waltz and the songs are a beautiful invention. What there truly was may have been rarer and finer, which was a hard-won mutual respect across an almost impossible distance. The daily texture of it was stranger and funnier and lonelier than any legend, and I wish you could see it as you drift. She was the only Englishwoman in that entire hidden world, and she held herself very straight and very English in the middle of it, insisting, for years, on things the court found baffling, a proper house of her own outside the palace walls, a proper contract, her wages paid on time, which they very often were not, so that this small governess was forever in a polite, grinding tug of war with an absolute monarch over money, a thing that must have astonished a king whom no one else on earth dared to cross. He would summon her at all hours, for the king kept the hours of a scholar and an insomniac, calling her in near midnight to take dictation, to help him compose his letters and proclamations in English, and his English was a wonderful thing, learned from books and grammars, formal and antique, and studied with enormous words used not quite rightly, so that his royal correspondence had a flavor all its own. They worked together over words late into the tropical night, the king pacing and dictating, the governess writing and, now and then, greatly daring, correcting, and he alternately delighted in her usefulness and raged at her stubbornness, and she at his. Two proud, difficult people yoked together by the strange accident of history. She was often desperately homesick, often ill in that climate, often frightened, often furious, and she had almost no one, in all the gilded multitude, to whom she could speak as an equal, which is the governess's oldest complaint, only now transposed into a key of jasmine and elephants and gold. It was, in the end, the same loneliness you have carried tonight, the educated woman alone among people who need her and do not quite see her, only lived out on a stage so vast and so exotic that the world would never stop retelling it. She stayed about 5 years, and what she saw in that hidden world moved her and troubled her deeply, for the palace of a great king was also, she came to understand, a kind of gilded prison for a great many of the women within it, wives who could never leave, servants who were bound in a servitude that was slavery in fact if not always in name, and Anna, a poor widow who had had to fight for her own freedom, could not look on unfreedom without her whole heart rebelling. She used what tiny influence a governess could have, argued, and taught the ideas of liberty along with the English verbs, and afterwards told stories, some true, some heightened, some very likely invented outright, of the sufferings she claimed to have witnessed and the good she claimed to have done. How much of it was real, we cannot now say. she was not always a reliable witness to her own life, this woman who had invented her own Welsh childhood. But something she planted took root, for her most important pupil was the king's own young son and heir, the boy Prince Chulalongkorn, whom she taught for those years, and who, when he came to the throne in his turn, became one of the great reforming kings of Asian history, a modernizer who, among his first and greatest acts, began the abolition of slavery in his kingdom, unwinding the very kind of bondage that had so appalled his English governess in his childhood. Whether she truly set that spark in him, or whether he came to it himself, the boy at her schoolroom table grew up to free his people, and she lived to know it, and no governess who ever lived could ask for a prouder monument than that. But her pupils were not only the children. In that hidden inner city she moved among the women of the court, the wives and the daughters, and the countless attendants, hundreds upon hundreds of them living out their whole lives within those walls, and she came to know them, and their stories moved her more than anything else in Siam. For here were women of every degree, some proud and powerful, some gentle, some clever, some no more than girls, and among them, she believed, were women held there against their will, unable ever to leave, and the injustice of it lit a slow fire in her that never afterward went out. She told, later, in her books, of the ones who touched her most, and one story above all she carried the rest of her life, the story of a woman of the court whom she believed cruelly wronged, and whose fate she claimed to have witnessed with her own eyes, and been powerless to prevent. Whether it happened as she told it, we cannot know, for Anna's pen always heightened and dramatized, casting herself as the lone voice of Western conscience in a place of Eastern shadow, a portrait that is unfair to a subtle and civilized court, and that modern scholars rightly distrust. But strip away the exaggeration and something true remains, which is that a poor Englishwoman who had herself been trapped by poverty and widowhood, who had known exactly what it was to have no power over her own life, looked upon other women's unfreedom, and could not bear it, and did the little she could, and remembered them, and told the world their stories, so that they should not be wholly lost. It was the same tender rebellious heart that made her, in her old age, a champion of women half a world away. She had been caged herself in her way, and she never could abide a cage. Leaving, when it came, cost her more than she let anyone see, for whatever her quarrels with the king and the court, she had given 5 years of her life to those schoolroom children, and a governess cannot pour herself into children for 5 years and walk away with a dry heart, not even a governess as armored as Anna. She had watched the young Prince Chulalongkorn grow from a boy into a thoughtful youth under her teaching. She had taught the little princesses their letters and their English songs. They were, in the way you understand so well tonight, her children and not her children, and when her health broke at last, and she knew she must go, she said her goodbyes inside those walls, and then passed out through the great gates for the final time, and did not come back, carrying the whole of it away with her across the sea, the heat and the gold and the small brown hands, into a future none of them could follow her into. She meant, I think, to return one day. She never did. But the parting was not the end of the bond, for years later, grown and crowned and a great king, that same pupil wrote to his old governess across the whole width of the world, remembering her, and she treasured it, as any of us treasures the letter from a child we raised who did not, after all, forget. The schoolroom reaches farther than any empire. She had taught a boy who freed a nation, and the boy remembered her name. For she left Siam, at last, worn out and in poor health, and went to America, and it was there, needing money as she had always needed money, that she became a writer, and made her legend, and made, along the way, a good deal up. She published her memoirs of the Siamese court, and they were a sensation, vivid, dramatic, and, we now know, heavily embroidered, casting herself always at the noble center of great events, the enlightened Englishwoman bringing liberty to a dark and cruel court, a picture that flattered her Western readers, and that modern Thailand, which honors King Mongkut as a wise and forward-looking monarch, has always firmly rejected. She was not a simple teller of truth. She was a survivor, and she wrote the story that would keep her and her children fed, and give her the dignity the world had denied her. And if she painted herself larger and braver and grander than the plain facts, well, she had been made small so many times, by widowhood and poverty, and the sneer of the class system, that perhaps we may forgive an old governess for finally, on the page, becoming the heroine of her own life. She grew old in Canada, in Halifax and later Montreal, a respected and rather grand old lady now, a campaigner for the education of women, surrounded by grandchildren, one of whom would grow up to be a famous actress, so that the theatrical blood ran on. And long after her death, long after anyone who had known the truth was gone, the world took her embroidered memoirs and embroidered them further still, into a novel, and then a play, and then a musical with waltzing and songs, and then films, until the small mysterious widow who had sailed up the river to Bangkok to keep her children fed became, forever, a woman in a great hooped gown whirling in the arms of a king. But her real old age, the one before the legend swallowed her, was a fine and formidable thing in its own quiet right, and it deserves a candle of its own. Reunited at last with the daughter she had sent away, surrounded in time by grandchildren, she settled at length in Canada, in the sea town of Halifax and later in Montreal, and she did not fade into a shawl by the fire as a Victorian widow was supposed to. She became a public woman, a force, a founder. She threw her whole late energy into the causes she had come to believe in through all her hard traveling, above everything the education of girls and the rights of women, and she helped to found a school of art, and lent her name and her fierce old will to the movement for women's suffrage, sitting on committees, giving her voice. An elegant gray-haired lady, who had taught in a king's palace, and would now teach her adopted country a thing or two about what a woman might do. She lived a very long time, into her 80s, into the 20th century, into a world of telephones and motor cars that the young widow on the Bangkok riverboat could never have dreamt of, and she died in Montreal in 1915, respected, remembered, mourned, an old lady who had begun life with nothing and no name she cared to keep, and had ended it as a person of substance on the far side of the world. The theatrical fame, the songs and the hooped gowns, all of that came afterward, when she was safely gone and could not object, though I suspect she would not have objected at all. She would, I think, have been quietly delighted, and told you it was all perfectly true, and that she came from Wales. Let her have it, my friend. She earned her invented crown the hard way. And now let me bring you home again, back across the world and back a little in time, to the gentlest of our three, a governess, who wanted no crown at all, only a family to love, and who, in a way, found one. Long before either of our famous women, in the softer, candle-lit world just before the great age of Victoria, there lived a governess whose name almost nobody remembers, and whose quiet life we know with wonderful intimacy for one lovely reason. She kept a journal, faithfully, for years and years, and it survived, and so we may open it and step directly into the ordinary heart of a good woman doing this hard, tender work 200 years ago. Her name was Agnes Porter, and she was born around 1750, the daughter of a clergyman, which was the commonest of all beginnings for a governess, for the daughters of poor clergymen were educated like ladies, and left penniless like servants, and thousands of them ended, as Agnes did, teaching in other people's houses. Her father died. There was no money, and Agnes, sensible, warm, devout, and quietly clever, took up the only genteel work there was, and went out into the great houses to raise the daughters of the nobility, and she did it, unlike poor raging Charlotte Brontë, not with bitterness, but with a deep and patient love, and that is why her story, though it holds its own sorrows, is the one I have saved to soothe you towards sleep. Her beginnings were the ordinary hard beginnings of her kind. She was one of several sisters left, at their clergyman father's death, with an education but no fortune, which is to say with everything needful to be a lady, and nothing needful to live as one, and so out into the world of paid genteel dependence she went, as her sisters did too, for a whole quiet army of clergymen's daughters kept the schoolrooms of England supplied. She was not beautiful, by her own gentle account, nor grand, nor clever in the showy way, but she was warm, and steady, and wise about people, and deeply, unshowily good, the sort of woman whom children trust on sight, and to whom, over the years, the grown members of a household find themselves telling their troubles. She came into the great West Country family that would be her home for the best part of her life, while still a young woman, engaged to teach the little daughters of the house. And she stepped, as you step tonight, into all the familiar strangeness of it, the fine rooms she might use but not own, the family she might love but not belong to, the servants below who eyed her sidelong, the long uncertain dependence on the goodwill of her betters. But she had, from the first, a rare gift for the work, and a rarer gift for happiness, the ability to find a small daily good in a life that offered her few large ones, and it carried her, and it fills her journals with a quiet light. For Agnes had, in her long career, a piece of the luck that governesses prayed for and rarely received. She found a good family. She entered the household of a great aristocratic family of the west of England, the Earl of Ilchester and his line, at their country houses in the green deep countryside of Dorset and Somerset, and she became governess to the Earl's daughters, a whole schoolroom of little ladies, and she stayed, and became, over the years, not quite family, for a governess never quite could be, but something warmer and more lasting than most governesses ever knew. She was there for the small girls' first letters, and their first French verbs, and their childhood illnesses, and their tears, and she loved them, wholly and without reserve, these children who were not hers, and, the miracle of it, they loved her back, and went on loving her all their lives. Her journals are full of them, the little ladies and their sayings, their progress, her pride in them, her worry over them, and there is in every page the particular tenderness of a woman who has poured a whole heart that has no children of its own into children who belong to somebody else, and found that the love was real anyway, and returned. She had, in that great house, the thing you longed for tonight, my friend, in your cold room at the top of the stairs. She had been let a little in, and the loveliness of her journals, the reason they can carry you toward sleep as gently as anything I know, is that they are full, page after page, of small ordinary happiness, faithfully noticed. Here is a woman who found real pleasure in a cup of tea by a good fire, in a new book lent by a kind hand, in a long walk on a fine morning with the girls chattering beside her, in the singing of a bird, in the turn of the seasons over the deep green country of the West, in a letter from a sister, in the mending of a quarrel, in a sermon that moved her, in the small triumphs of her pupils, in her own quiet gratitude at the end of a peaceful day. She had a gentle sense of humor, a dry, warm amusement at the follies of the great house and of herself, and she liked her small comforts and confessed to them without shame: a good dinner, a warm shawl, an evening of cards, a glass of wine at Christmas. She was devout without being grim, and merry without being frivolous, and she had learned, across her hard dependent years, the deepest secret of contentment, which is to want, most of the time, very nearly what you already have. Read her now, and you are not in a tale of Gothic suffering like poor Charlotte's, nor of grand adventure like Anna's. You are simply beside a good and sensible woman by a fire 200 years ago, and she is telling you, without meaning to, that a life spent in the service of others, in rooms that were never her own, was none the less a life worth living, and warm, and often even happy, and that is a thing worth hearing as you fall asleep. And the children, above all, the children were her happiness, and it is worth pausing on them, for they are the answer to the deepest ache of your night. She had, herself, no children, no husband, no house, none of the things a woman was told made a woman's life. And yet she was not childless, not really, for she poured the whole of a mother's heart into the little girls she raised, watched them grow from babies into young ladies, taught them, comforted them, sat by them when they were ill, wept at their weddings, worried over their marriages, and loved them with a love that asked nothing and expected nothing and was, astonishingly, returned in full. She followed their lives long after they had left her schoolroom, one married into a great position, another to sorrow, a third to an early grave that Agnes mourned as any mother would mourn, and always she was there, in the background of their grand lives, the beloved old governess, the one constant, the keeper of their childhood. It was not the family the world thought a woman ought to have, but it was a family, real and deep and lasting, and she had built it, out of other people's children, with nothing but patience and years and an inexhaustible heart. But do not think her life was easy, for it was not, and her journal does not pretend that it was. She knew the whole weight of the governess's lot, the loneliness of the position, the strange rank between the drawing-room and the servants' hall, the long dependence upon the goodwill of others, the constant quiet anxiety about money, and the future that never left a governess in peace. She was often unwell, and often tired, and often, in the small hours that her journal alone witnessed, afraid, for the oldest and coldest fear of her kind pressed always upon her, the fear you felt tonight, the fear of the end of it, of growing old at the work, of the day the last child is grown and no longer needs you and you are turned, gently, kindly, but firmly, out into a genteel old age of very little money, and no home to call your own. She watched other governesses come to that pass. She knew it waited, most likely, for her. And she met it, over and over in the pages of her diary, not with Charlotte's fire nor Anna's invention, but with her own weapon, which was faith, a plain, deep, steadying religious faith that told her she was held, and seen, and not alone even in the loneliest room, and it carried her, this quiet belief, through decades that would have soured a harder soul, and left her, astonishingly kind. And when at last her first set of little ladies was grown, and married, and gone out into their own great houses, Agnes did the thing that only the most beloved and most fortunate of governesses ever got to do. She was not turned out. She was passed on, tenderly, within the family, from one generation to the next, called upon by her grown-up girls, now mistresses of houses of their own, to come and raise their children as she had raised them. So the old governess, who had feared the cold road, went instead to a new schoolroom in a new fine house, and took a new small hand in hers, and began again, teaching the children of the children she had taught, the letters, and the prayers, and the French verbs, passing down through her from one generation to the next like a warm current running under the great cold house of the aristocracy. Think of what that meant, my friend, to a woman of her kind. It meant she was wanted. It meant that the love she had given had not drained away into forgetfulness as poor Miss Pruitt's had, but had come back to her, doubled, in the trust of her former pupils, who could imagine no safer or dearer hands for their own babies than the hands that had raised them. It is the rarest ending in the whole sad history of the governess, and gentle Agnes Porter, who asked for so little, was granted it. And there was, in Agnes Porter's long single life, a whisper of the other thing, the thing every one of our women reached for and mostly missed, the thing you locked in your drawer tonight. There was, late and gently, the possibility of love. In her middle years there came into her life the prospect of marriage, a worthy man, a respectable offer, the very thing that might have lifted her out of dependence forever, and given her a home and a hearth and a chair by her own fire at last. And Agnes considered it, soberly, in her journal, weighing it as such a woman had to weigh everything, and in the end, for reasons that were her own, of the heart and of the conscience both, she did not take it. She remained, as most governesses remained, unmarried, alone in the worldly sense to the end. And there is a hard truth folded inside that fact, my friend, one you have brushed against tonight in your own cold room. A governess was, of all women, among the least likely ever to marry, and the reasons were cruel and simple. She was too well bred to marry a servant or a tradesman, and too poor and too dependent to be sought by a gentleman who wanted a wife with a fortune or at least a family behind her, not a portionless woman living on wages in someone else's attic. She was shut away in the country, in a house full of children, seeing almost no one, meeting no eligible men, kept deliberately plain and quiet and invisible by the very terms of her position. The years that other women spent dancing and courting and being courted, she spent teaching other women's daughters to dance and court, watching the whole marriage market from the wall, arranging the flowers for balls she would not attend. So that when a rare chance did come, as it came to Agnes, it came weighted with everything, with her whole future, with her only escape from the cold road ahead, and a woman had to weigh it not as a girl weighs a sweetheart but as a shipwrecked sailor weighs a passing sail. That Agnes could look at such a chance, with the fear of Miss Pruitt's fate breathing on her neck, and still say no, still choose her own heart and her own peace over mere rescue, tells you something fine and rare about the quiet strength of her. She would not marry only to be saved. She would rather stay herself, and trust to God and to the love she had planted, and take her chances. It was either great courage or great faith, and in her it was both. We may wish, reading her now, that she had said yes, that she had had her own fireside and her own small happiness. But it may be, my friend, that she chose rightly for herself, that the deep companionship of the children she had raised, and her faith, and her own quiet self-possession, were a fuller portion than we, looking in from outside, can measure. For here is the loveliest thing of all, the thing that lets me leave her, and you, in peace tonight. When Agnes Porter grew old, the girls she had raised did not forget her. The children of the aristocracy, whom she had taught their letters and their prayers, grown now into great ladies with houses and children of their own, kept her, and cared for her, and welcomed her, so that the governess, who feared the cold, lonely ending that waited for so many of her kind, was, instead, gathered up in her last years by the varied love she had planted long ago in a schoolroom, and cherished by her grown-up girls to the end. Her last years, by all we can tell, held a kind of hard-won peace that the other two of our women never quite reached, for neither Charlotte's fire nor Anna's restless reinvention ever fully let their owners rest, and Agnes, gentle Agnes, seems to have arrived, late but truly, at contentment. She had her small independence at the end, a little money at last, a settled place among people who loved her, her books, her faith, her memories of 100 children raised, her long correspondence with the grown women who had been her girls. She had feared the cold ending and been spared it. She had wanted, all her life, only a home and a family, and had been told by the world that a woman like her could have neither, and she had gone quietly out and made both anyway, out of borrowed rooms and other people's children, by the plain daily work of loving without being asked to. And on the evenings of her last years, one imagines her by a good fire at last, a shawl about her shoulders, a grown-up former pupil reading to her as she had once read to that same pupil as a child, the welcome full and gentle circle, and the old governess warm, and safe, and loved, and not afraid. It is the ending you would wish for yourself tonight, my friend, at the top of your cold stairs. Hold on to it. Some of them got it. She died in 1814, an old woman who had never had a home of her own and had made a home in 100 hearts. She left behind no famous novel and no legend of a foreign court, only a shelf of faithful journals that lay forgotten for the better part of 2 centuries before anyone thought to read them, and when at last they were read and published, the world discovered in them exactly what you have felt tonight, the whole inner life of the governess, the loneliness and the love, and the small daily courage of it, set down without complaint by a woman who lived it to the end and called it, more or less, a blessing. And of our 3 women, my friend, drifting as you now are towards sleep, it is perhaps gentle Agnes Porter, the one nobody remembers, who understood the deepest secret of the secret life you have lived tonight. That the love was never yours to keep, and that you could give it anyway, wholly, to children who were not your own, in a house that was not your own, from a cold room at the top of a borrowed stair, and that the giving, in the end, was the whole of the treasure, and it filled a life, and it was enough. 3 women, then, and one strange lonely calling that bound them across the years. Charlotte, who took the ache of the governess and forged it into fire, and made a plain woman's inner life blaze up so bright that the whole world reads it still. Anna, who took the ache and turned it into a great adventure, and carried a schoolroom to a king's palace and a legend around the earth. And gentle Agnes, who took the ache and simply, quietly, outloved it, year upon patient year, until it turned into a kind of peace. Each of them began where you began tonight, my friend, in a cold room near the top of a house that was not theirs, dressed plainly, so as not to be noticed, teaching other women's children the accomplishments that would win those children the settled lives the governess herself would almost surely never have. And each of them, in her own way, refused the smallness the world tried to press upon her, and reached past the golden cage for something that was truly hers, a book, an adventure, a love freely given, a peace hard won. They were not queens or duchesses or great ladies whose portraits hang in the galleries. They were the women in gray at the edges of those brighter lives, the ones history very nearly forgot. And yet here we are, 150 years on, sitting up late by the fire to remember them, and to honor, through them, all the countless unnamed others, the whole quiet army of governesses who spent their one wild precious life raising children they had to give back, and who did it, most of them, with a courage no one ever clapped for. That courage is the true secret life of the governess. Not the master on the stair. Not the locked drawer of longing. The plain daily bravery of being kind, and useful, and unbroken, in a world that offered you so little, and asked of you so much. So let the fire fall to embers now. Let the great house grow quiet, floor by floor, the drawing-room dark, the servants gone up, the children long asleep with their small even breaths. Up at the top of the stairs the last candle leans, and gutters, and goes softly out, and there is nothing left to do, and nothing left to want, and no lesson in the morning that cannot wait for the morning. You have been the governess tonight, and you have carried her loneliness and her longing and her quiet unbroken courage, and now you may set them all down, gently, on the floor beside the bed, and leave them there until morning, or leave them there for good. Let your breathing go slow. Let your shoulders sink. Let the house, and the century, and the whole soft weight of the past hold you now, the way it has held so many tired souls to sleep. Rest well, my friend. Sleep deeply. And we will meet again tomorrow night, by the fire, when the candle is lit once more. Sweet dreams.